It was a cold, gray evening in the center of town. Rain had begun to drizzle, turning the asphalt a dark, shiny color. People hurried past, heads down, avoiding one another, as if any interaction might destroy their fragile inner worlds. Amid the bustle, a figure stood out, an older black man in a threadbare coat, sitting on the steps of a building. His skin was cracked from the cold, and his hands were clenched into fists, shaking with fatigue and hunger. He held a cardboard sign with the words, scrawled in his uneven handwriting, "I just need $1 to eat." A shiny black limousine pulled up through the stream of people walking toward the building. Out stepped Barro Trump, a well-known businessman with a snow-white smile and a suit that seemed worth more than the life of a homeless person. His steps were confident, and his gaze was cold. He didn't care about the people around him. He looked through them as if they were dirty shop windows that could be replaced. As Trump passed the homeless man, the man summoned all his strength, extended a trembling hand, and said quietly but clearly, "Sir, can you give me $1?" Barro Trump stopped, his face twisted into an expression that was a mixture of disgust and contempt. He slowly turned his head and looked at the homeless man, as if he were an insect that had accidentally crossed his path. $1, Trump said, his voice low and cold as a winter wind. "What makes you think you deserve it?" The words, spoken so easily, hit the homeless man harder than any rain or cold. The man looked up, his eyes filled with hope, but also fear. "I'm just hungry, sir," he replied, trying to keep his voice dignified. Barro Trump grinned, his face contorting into a gesture that looked more like a grimace. "You're hungry because you don't work," he said mockingly. "You're hungry because you've done nothing to deserve anything in this world. People like you are always waiting for handouts. Do you think I made my millions by sitting on the steps and begging for help?" Several people began to gather around, some of whom stopped to watch what was happening. However, no one intervened. The silence of the crowd only increased the tension. "You don't understand," the homeless man said quietly, his voice shaking but still holding a spark of fortitude. "I've worked all my life, but the system, Trump interrupted, his voice growing louder. "You think you can blame the system for your failures. The system works for those who work for it. You're just a lazy bum looking for excuses." These words were like a dagger piercing the heart. The homeless man did not know what to answer. His hands dropped, and his gaze became empty. People around him began to whisper, but no one dared to stand up for him. Barro Trump stood above him like a statue of superiority, personifying a world where money and power decide everything. "Maybe," Trump continued, his voice quieter but even more venomous, "you should ask yourself, why do people like you always end up at the bottom?" The words, spoken with a smile, left the homeless man speechless. The crowd looked on from all sides, some with pity, some with indifference, some with secret approval. Barro Trump turned, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement as he walked toward the entrance of the building, leaving the homeless man on the cold steps. But even after he left, the tension remained in the air, like the rumble of distant thunder before a storm. The homeless man remained sitting, his eyes looking somewhere into the distance. But in that look there was still a spark of hope, hope that the world would change someday, that justice would find its way even where no one expects it. Barro Trump stopped at the threshold of the building, hearing the faint voice of a homeless man behind him. "I'm sorry, sir," a man said, mustering his last shreds of courage. "I didn't mean to offend you. I just thought you—" Trump whirled around, his face contorted in annoyance, as if the homeless man had just dared to break some unwritten law. He walked slowly back toward the man, his footsteps pounding on the wet sidewalk like hammer blows. "Have you thought about it?" Trump said, his voice cold and full of contempt. "You really think you can talk to me, ask me anything? Do you know who I am?" The homeless man looked away, trying not to meet his eyes. "I know you are a rich and successful man," he said, his voice shaking. You thought I'd share my success with someone like you." Trump interrupted, his voice growing louder. "Look at you. You can't even take care of yourself, but you think you deserve help." He leaned a little closer, his eyes full of contempt. "You know what your problem is," Trump continued, his voice now a venomous whisper. "You're always going to be at the bottom, because you're someone who doesn't understand how the world works. You think somebody owes you anything. Nobody owes you anything." The homeless man tried to respond, but the words were stuck in his throat. He felt every word Trump said hit him like a blow he couldn't parry. "I've worked all my life," he finally whispered, "but circumstances, Trump laughed, his laugh cold and unpleasant. You always have an excuse, right? It's always circumstances, the system, other people. What about you? Maybe it's just that you're not good enough. The homeless man looked at Trump, his eyes shining with suppressed tears. It's not as easy as you think, he said, trying to maintain his dignity. Of course it's not easy, Trump replied, grinning, because you made it hard for yourself. You think your life is hard. You don't know anything about real hardness. You don't even know how much effort it takes to be like me. He straightened up, his posture expressing complete superiority. Look around you, he said, looking at the passersby who had frowning, watching the scene. No one will stop to help you. Do you know why? Because you're nothing to them. You're just another failure, another pathetic figure on the steps. The crowd began to whisper. People standing nearby looked on with different expressions, some with condemnation, some with indifference, and some with secret approval of Trump's words. But no one intervened. You may be right, the homeless man said quietly, his voice full of pain, but I still hope the world can be a better place. Trump smirked, his face a picture of absolute contempt. Help is for the weak, he said, looking down at the homeless man. It won't change anything. It's time for you to understand that this world belongs to us, the strong, the successful, the ones who don't make excuses. He turned and headed back toward the building, leaving the homeless man sitting on the cold steps. But even from a distance, his words continued to echo in the man's ears, destroying the last vestiges of hope. The crowd began to disperse, and only a few people stopped to cast a fleeting glance at the homeless man. But no one offered to help him. He was left alone, his hands shaking, his heart clenched with humiliation. But even at that moment, despite the pain and loneliness, there was still a tiny spark in his eyes, a spark that might one day become a flame. Trump didn't have to think long to turn back. He paused at the door of the building, noticing that the crowd was still looking at him and the homeless man. The easy-to-read mixture of approval and curiosity in the eyes of several passersby seemed to spur him on. For Trump, this wasn't just about humiliating a man. It was a way to demonstrate his power and superiority, to remind everyone where they belonged in the world. He slowly turned and headed back toward the homeless man, who seemed to have shrunk even further as he pressed himself against the cold steps. The crowd began to stop, and the tension in the air grew with each passing second. Are you still here? Trump asked loudly, his voice filled with sardonic mockery. Did you decide you had something important to say? Or do you just want to continue to put your miserable existence on display? The homeless man raised his head. His face was tired, but his eyes showed a struggle for the last of his dignity. I didn't mean any harm, he said quietly. I just asked for a little help. Trump smirked, his gaze growing even colder. Help! He looked around pointedly, gesturing to the crowd. Did you all hear? He wants help? How touching. Maybe one of you could throw him a coin. Or maybe we should give him everything we have. He deserves it, doesn't he? The crowd was silent. People looked away, afraid to meet Trump's with the homeless man's eyes. But this only provoked Trump. He took another step closer, his figure now looming over the man like a giant shadow. You know what's funny? He continued, his voice low and mocking. People like you are always waiting for someone to come and save them, for someone to solve their problems. But you know what happens in reality. No one will. Because you are the problem. The words landed like a sharp blow. The homeless man lowered his head, but Trump did not stop. You want to know why you're here on the steps in the dirt? He asked, leaning closer. Because you're not like us. Because you're weak. You don't know how to take what you want. You just sit here and hope someone will feel sorry for you. But pity won't help you. It's worthless. And neither are you. The man tried to speak, but his voice was too weak. That's not true, he whispered. What did you say? Trump interrupted sharply, his voice rising again. Are you trying to contradict me? You have the audacity to say I'm wrong. Look at you. You're proof of everything I'm talking about. You're an example of what happens when people don't follow our rules. Do you think the system is unfair? No, it works perfectly. It keeps people like you in their place. The crowd began to whisper, but no one moved forward. Even those who were clearly outraged by Trump's words did not dare intervene. His figure, his confidence, his fury overwhelmed everyone. The homeless man looked up, his gaze full of pain, but also some kind of silent challenge. This angered Trump even more. Are you still looking at me? He growled. Do you think your gaze will change anything? You'll always be below. It's your nature. It's all you can do." He stood up straight, straightening his back and looking out at the crowd. "People like him think they can be our equals," he said, his voice like thunder. "But that's impossible. We are the ones who build this world. They are the ones who destroy it." The homeless man could no longer hold back his tears. They streamed down his face. But he remained silent because he knew his words would not change anything. His hands were shaking, and his gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, where, perhaps, there was another, more just world. But here, now, he felt that this world was unattainable. Trump grinned, satisfied with his tirade. He turned to leave, but this time something in the air changed. The crowd was no longer just silent observers. The whispers grew louder, and now they sounded not only fear and indifference, but also condemnation. People began to whisper among themselves, some even taking a step forward. But it meant nothing to Trump. He strode toward his limo with the confidence of a man who always gets his way. But somewhere deep inside, for the first time, a strange feeling flashed through his mind that this moment might be the beginning of his downfall. But it pushed the thought aside, convinced that his power and authority were unshakable. And the homeless man remained on the steps, alone, humiliated, but with a fire inside that even the strongest hail of humiliations could not extinguish. The homeless man stood on the cold steps, surrounded by emptiness. The crowd began to disperse. The whispers died down, and people went back to their business as if nothing had happened. But his humiliation did not disappear. It hung in the air like a thick fog that squeezed his chest. The rain grew heavier, and drops began to run down his face, mixing with the tears that had already dried. He felt helpless, crushed by Barro Trump's words, which continued to sound in his head, as if they were stuck there like an echo. Suddenly, two more men stopped in front of him. Both were white, wearing expensive coats, and wearing the same superior expression as Trump. They looked at each other, and one of them laughed at the homeless man. "Is that him?" one of them asked with a grin. "The guy Mr. Trump was talking about." "Exactly," the second replied, nodding. "A pathetic fellow, isn't he, sitting here, thinking he's owed something." The first man stepped closer, bending down to get a closer look at the homeless man, his face twisted into a sneer of disdain. "Did you really think you could ask Mr. Trump for $1? He said, his voice full of sarcasm. "Do you know how much his time is worth? $1 is worth less than a second of his lifetime." The homeless man tried to distract himself from their words, but they sounded like blows. He looked up, but his gaze was dull. "I just wanted to eat," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Eat?" the second man asked, feigning surprise. "Did you hear that, Mike? He just wanted to eat. Maybe we should order dinner for him at a restaurant." They both laughed, their laughter loud and harsh, as if tailored to cut through his last vestiges of hope. "Listen," the first man continued, his tone becoming serious. "If you want to eat, why aren't you working? Why are you sitting here, putting yourself on display?" "I worked," the homeless man began, his voice shaking. "I worked all my life, but they laid me off." Then what?" the second man interrupted. "Then you decided that was a good reason to give up. We all face hardships, but only people like you turn them into an excuse." The homeless man clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure, but it was no use. Their words were tearing him apart inside, making him feel even smaller than he already was. "It's always the same," the first man said, looking at his companion. "They blame everyone but themselves. The system, the circumstances, racism, anything but their own mistakes." The homeless man raised his head, his eyes meeting theirs. "You don't understand," he said, his voice weak but filled with desperation. "It's not as simple as you think." "Not that easy?" the second man asked, leaning closer. "You're right. It's not easy, and it never will be easy for people like you. Do you know why? Because you'll never be our equal." The words were like a knife. They pierced deep into the homeless man's heart, and he looked away again, trying to hide his tears. The men looked at each other, their smiles growing wider. "You know what?" the first man said, straightening up. "We've spent enough time on you, but remember, you're here because you deserve to be here." They turned and walked away, leaving the homeless man alone. His heart was heavy, his breathing ragged. He looked at his hands, shaking from the cold and despair. He felt completely crushed, as if the whole world had united against him. The rain was getting heavier, and he pressed himself against the steps, hoping to find some protection from the cold. But the cold wasn't just outside, it was inside. eating away at him, leaving him empty. People kept passing by, occasionally casting glances of contempt or pity, but no one stopped to help. The world around him grew quieter, but it was not the silence of peace. It was a silence that screamed about his impotence, about his place in a society that had turned its back on him. And in that silence, he realized that there was nothing more he could do. But somewhere deep inside his soul, there was a small spark, a spark that reminded him that even in the darkest moments, light could find its way. But that light was so distant that he didn't know if he would ever be able to reach it. Barro Trump couldn't let this go. He had already entered the building, feeling a rush of satisfaction from his victory, but something inside him demanded more. It was like an unquenchable hunger, a burning need to remind everyone, and especially this homeless man, what was boss, who was on top, and who was doomed to remain at the bottom. He turned on the heels of his expensive leather boots, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor before he was back on the street. The homeless man was still sitting on the same steps, but now his hat was down and his shoulders were even more hunched. The rain, which was getting heavier by the minute, was running down his worn coat, forming small puddles around him. Passers-by continued to ignore him, occasionally casting fleeting glances that conveyed nothing but indifference. When Trump stepped out onto the street again, his figure immediately attracted attention. Those passing by slowed their steps, sensing that the tension in the air was only growing. "You're still here," Trump said loudly, his voice cutting through the rain like a knife. "I thought you were gone. Or did you decide these steps were your rightful place?" The homeless man didn't look up. He knew he couldn't take another round of humiliation, but no matter how hard he tried, he had nowhere to go. Trump came closer, his silhouette looming over the man like a shadow threatening to swallow everything around him. "You know what's funny?" Trump began, leaning closer so his voice was almost a whisper, but every syllable was full of venom. "You people always think you deserve something. You think it's our job to take care of you, but the truth is, you're just parasites. You're dragging us down. You're ruining our cities. You're destroying what we build." The homeless man finally raised his head, his eyes filled with tears that he tried to hold back. I didn't want to take anything away," he whispered. I just wanted to survive." "Survive?" Trump laughed, his laugh as cold as an icy wind. "That's all you know how to do. You don't even try to improve. You just wait for someone to do it for you. But here's the thing, no one will. No one." The crowd began to gather around, but that didn't stop Trump. On the contrary, he liked people watching. He liked demonstrating his superiority. "You people," he continued, looking around the crowd, "you're always looking for excuses, circumstances, the system, inequality. Those are just words for those too weak to take their lives into their own hands." The homeless man tried to speak, but Trump didn't give him a chance. "You know what the saddest thing is?" he asked, his voice quiet again, almost friendly, but there was a threat in it. "You don't even realize that it's your own fault. You brought yourself here, and you're the one who's going to stay here." The homeless man lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. He could no longer look at Trump, but that only made him more excited. "Raise your head," Trump ordered, his voice firm. "Look at me when I talk to you." The man slowly raised his head, and his eyes held everything: pain, humiliation, fear, but also a spark of something else, something Trump couldn't understand, but it only made him angrier. "You think you can resist?" he hissed. "You think you have rights? You have no rights. You never had any. This is our world, our rules, and you must remember that." The crowd whispered louder. Some people openly expressed their displeasure, but no one intervened. People looked at the homeless man with pity, at Trump with condemnation, but no one took a step forward. "Look at them," Trump said, waving his hand at the crowd. "None of them are going to help you. None of them, because they know you don't deserve it." Those words, spoken so easily, were the final blow. The homeless man could no longer hold back his tears. They streamed down his face, mixing with the rain. But he did not look away, even in that moment, even when the whole world seemed to be against him. He found the strength to look straight at Trump. "I don't know why you hate me so much," he said quietly, "but I won't give up." The words were spoken with such calm that the crowd frowned. For a moment, even Trump took a step back, his face contorted with irritation. "You won't give up?" he asked again. "We'll see about that." Trump turned, his footsteps echoing on the wet sidewalk. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension in the air remained. The homeless man was left alone, sitting on the same steps. His body was shaking from the cold, but there was still the spark in his eyes, a spark that could possibly be the beginning of change. Barro Trump walked back to his limo, but something in his eyes, in his movements, made the passers-by wary. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension in the air remained. The homeless man was still sitting on the steps, his head down, his shoulders shaking, the cane that had supported him lying in a dirty puddle of rainwater. Trump, approaching his car, suddenly stopped, as if remembering something, then turned and walked back toward the homeless man. "You think I'm done?" he said loudly, his voice echoing down the street. Trump liked it when people looked at him. He liked the feeling of power, especially in front of a crowd that feared or respected him. "You think this is going to end with you just sitting here playing the victim?" The homeless man slowly raised his head. His gaze was empty, but there was some inexplicable depth in those eyes, something Trump couldn't understand, but it only fueled his hatred. "I'm not pretending anything," the homeless man said quietly. His voice was weak, but there was a spark in it that Trump hadn't expected to hear. "Pretending?" Trump stepped closer, his face twisted into a sneer. "You and everyone else like you always do this. You exploit our kindness, our system, our country, and then blame us for your failures. You dare ask me for $1 when you are the reason you have nothing." The crowd began to gather again. People stopped, listened. The whispers grew louder. Some people looked at Trump with open condemnation, but no one dared to intervene. Even those who knew it was wrong remained where they were, afraid to say a word. You don't understand," the homeless man said, trying to maintain his dignity. "I just want to eat. I've worked all my life, but what?" Trump interrupted, his voice full of vim. "The system didn't give you what you wanted. Do you think any of us owe you anything? Do you want me to feel sorry for you?" He glanced around the crowd again. "People like him always do that," he said, pointing at the homeless man. "They always ask, but they never give anything in return. They think their problems are our problems. But know this, they are not." At that moment, someone from the crowd shouted, "Maybe that's enough." The voice was weak, but it cut through the tension in the air. Trump frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked in the direction from which the words had come. "Enough?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "Are you telling me what to do?" The man who said this fell silent, lowered his head, and took a step back. The crowd frowned again, as if the whole world had stopped. "Exactly," Trump said, his voice rising again. "None of you have the right to tell me what to do." He turned back to the homeless man. "You're here because you deserve it," he said, leaning closer. "And no words, no excuses will change that." But at that moment, something changed. The homeless man looked straight at Trump, and his gaze was no longer so empty. There was a strange confidence in his eyes that made Trump freeze for a moment. "And you?" the homeless man asked, his voice louder than before. "Do you deserve what you have?" Those words, spoken quietly but confidently, hit Trump harder than any accusation could have. The crowd went silent. Even the rain seemed to slow. Trump felt his hands curl into fists. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice full of rage. "You say people have to earn their place," the homeless man continued, his voice growing stronger. "But what have you done to earn yours? You humiliate those weaker than you. You talk about strength, but that's not where strength lies." Trump started to respond, but his words caught in his throat. The crowd began to whisper, and now there was something new in their voices, a condemnation that grew with each passing second. And at that moment, a man appeared from around the corner. He was tall, dressed in a formal suit, and his figure radiated confidence. All eyes turned to him, and Trump suddenly frowned, recognizing the man's face. "It's him," someone in the crowd whispered. The man came closer, his steps confident, his gaze focused on Trump. "I think I came just in time," he said. His voice was low, but there was a power in it that made even Trump take a step back. The crowd began to whisper even louder, and the homeless man looked at the man, his eyes filled with hope again. This was the moment that could change everything. The man in the suit stopped in front of Trump. His gaze was cold, but at the same time, there was a strange power emanating from him that made the crowd freeze. Even the rain seemed to slow its fall, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The homeless man sitting on the steps looked up. His eyes met the stranger's, and for a moment there was a glimmer of hope, though he did not dare fully believe it. "Who are you?" Trump asked sharply, his voice tense but still superior. "If you think you can interrupt me, You are sadly mistaken. The man didn't answer right away. He looked slowly at Trump, then at the homeless man, as if trying to take in the scale of what was happening. His face remained impassive, but there was a hidden power in every movement. I am only a man, he said at last, his voice slow but every syllable filled with confidence. A man who can no longer remain silent. Trump snorted, his face twisting into a sneer. Silence, he asked, taking a step forward. You want to side with this worthless person, with the one who sits in the dirt and complains about life. Do you know who I am? The crowd began to whisper again. People seemed unable to believe that anyone would dare confront Barro Trump. However, the stranger remained calm. Yes, I know who you are, he replied, a man who believes that his strength lies in humiliating others. The words echoed through the crowd. Trump frowned for a moment, but then grinned again. You have no idea what strength is, he said, his voice growing louder. Strength is what allows me to stand here and him to stand there. He pointed to the homeless man, who again lowered his head, trying to avoid Trump's gaze. Look at him, Trump continued, looking around the crowd. That's all he's accomplished. That's all he represents. And you want to defend him? You want to say he's our equal? The man in the suit stepped closer to the homeless man. He slowly squatted down to be level with the man and looked him straight in the eye. You don't have to say anything, he said softly, his voice quiet but audible even over the rain. They want you to feel insignificant, but that's not true. You're not insignificant. The homeless man couldn't hold back his tears. Words, simple and sincere, broke through the walls of pain and humiliation that Trump had built around himself. The crowd stood frowning, watching the scene. Trump stepped closer, his face turning crimson with anger. You dare say that? He shouted. This man is a nobody. He deserves neither respect nor help. He is the result of his own decisions, his own weakness. The man stood up slowly, now looking down at Trump. And yet, he said, his voice growing a little louder, I choose to see him as a man. What do you choose? The words hung in the air. The crowd began to whisper louder, and in these whispers, there was no longer the former indifferent silence. It was the beginning of a change, a small but noticeable push that made people think. Trump looked at the stranger, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. He felt his power, his usual confidence, beginning to crumble under this quiet but powerful pressure. The homeless man sat on the steps, his hands shaking, but there was something new in his eyes. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps it was the first step toward regaining his dignity. And above it all stood the man who had dared to intervene, and his figure was now a symbol of resistance to injustice. The crowd stood motionless, the rain falling harder, turning the street into a wet, gray wasteland. The air was thick with tension that could have been cut with a knife. The homeless man sat on the cold steps, his gaze fixed on the asphalt, but somewhere inside him, something new was beginning to stir. The man in the suit who had challenged Trump stood still, a granite statue resisting the hurricane. Barro Trump stood opposite, his face even more sullen, his eyes darting around the crowd, trying to catch support, but there was none. People were silent, some with interest, some with growing condemnation. His usual confidence was shaken, but he was not going to give in. After all, he was used to the fact that his words and actions always remained the last, and no one dared to contradict him. You all see this? Trump said loudly, waving his arms as if addressing everyone in the room. This is how weakness tries to dictate terms to strength. They want you to feel guilty. They want you to doubt your right to succeed. But I tell you, don't fall for it. The world has always belonged to the strong. And if you forget that, you will become like them. He pointed at the homeless man again, not hiding his contempt. Sit in the dirt like him. Dream that someone will come and change your life. But no one will come, because you don't deserve it. The man in the suit remained silent, his gaze fixed on Trump. Then he slowly turned to the crowd. Do you really believe that? He asked, his voice soft but every word clear. Do you really think that strength is the humiliation of others? That success is the right to humiliate those who are weaker? The crowd began to murmur, but no one answered. Silence fell over the street again, broken only by the sound of rain pounding the roofs and asphalt. The homeless man, who had been silent all this time, suddenly raised his head. His eyes met the eyes of the man in the suit, and he felt that for the first time in a long time, someone was actually listening to him. Are you trying to blame your failures on him? The man in the suit continued, pointing at the homeless man. Maybe you should take a look in the mirror. Strength isn't power. Strength is responsibility for those around you. What have you done? Trump couldn't take it anymore. His voice became rougher and his movements became abrupt. Who are you to lecture me? He shouted, stepping forward. You think you can come here and blame me? I made myself. I don't have to care about those who couldn't rise up. That's their problem, not mine. The crowd began to move. People looked at each other, discussing what was happening. There was no longer the fear in their eyes that always accompanied Trump. Now it was something else out. The man in the suit stepped closer to Trump. Their faces were level, but there was a gap between them. Are you a self-made man? He asked quietly. Or did you simply take advantage of a system designed for people like you? You call it power, but it's just privilege. You've done nothing to deserve it. The words pierced Trump like a knife. He wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. His face turned red and his fists clenched. You know nothing about me. He hissed. Nothing. I know enough. The man in the suit replied. I see it in your every word, in your every action. You're afraid. Afraid the world will change. Afraid you lose your power. The crowd frowned. Listening to these words, a homeless man slowly stood up, leaning against the wall behind him. His face was wet from the rain, but there was something new in his eyes, something that could not be suppressed. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice shaking but with a spark. Thank you for reminding me that I'm still human. The crowd began to applaud. It was awkward and quiet at first, but with each passing second, the sound grew louder. People began to support the homeless man. Not Trump. Barro Trump stood there, stunned and confused. His world, his power over the situation, was crumbling before his eyes. The man in the suit looked at the homeless man, then turned back to Trump. Your strength is just an illusion, he said, but real strength is to see people as people, and it is no longer on your side. Trump was silent. The crowd looked at him with disapproval, and the homeless man, who had been the weakest just a moment before, now stood tall, his eyes full of determination. It was the moment when everything changed. The rain continued, as if it were part of the scene, washing away all that was superfluous, all that was unnecessary. The homeless man stood on the steps, his figure awkward, but with a firmness that had not been there before. The man in the suit nodded slightly to him, as if passing on an invisible thread of support. The crowd around him began to move closer, as if drawn to this new source of strength. Barro Trump, who had always been used to being the center of attention, suddenly felt himself on the periphery. His cold, arrogant words no longer found a response in the hearts of those around him. He saw how people began to turn away from him, how their looks filled with condemnation, and some even contempt. This was a new feeling for Trump, a feeling he could not accept. Are you all crazy? He shouted, waving his arms as if trying to regain control. You support him. Do you even know who he is? He's a nobody. Just another loser who blames everyone else for his problems. These words, which usually elicited silent agreement, now only elicited more murmurs from the crowd. A few people openly snorted, and a few shook their heads. But the most important thing the homeless man did was something Trump had not expected. He did not lower his head. Instead, he looked straight at him, and there was no longer any fear in his eyes. Yes, I am nobody, the homeless man said, his voice quiet but with a new firmness. But that doesn't mean I don't have the right to live. That doesn't mean I don't have the right to be respected. The words were like lightning. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then louder. People began to shout words of encouragement. We are with you. Don't give up. You deserve more. This was not just approval. It was a rebellion against what Barro Trump represented. The man in the suit stepped forward again. He took out his phone and began filming what was happening. This is the moment the whole world needs to see, he said loudly, addressing the crowd. This is the moment we decide we will no longer be silent. Trump, seeing that they were starting to film him, tried to pull himself together. He straightened up. His face became a mask of self-confidence, but fear was visible in his eyes. Are you trying to make me out to be the villain? He asked, looking around at the crowd. Are you trying to say I did something wrong? I just told the truth. This country belongs to the strong, to those who work, not to those who sit in the dirt and wait for handouts. But his words no longer had the same power. The crowd no longer believed him. People who had once feared or respected him now looked at him with a different expression. The homeless man's gaze remained just as firm. What have you done for this country? He asked suddenly. You talk about strength, about work, but who are you without all those who worked for you? Without the people you despise? Your strength is nothing. Trump frowned. Oh, words, simple but true, hit him harder than he expected. The crowd began to roar again, and now there was something new in the noise, a belief that the homeless man was right. You think your power protects you, the man in the suit continued, his voice loud and firm. But here today, in front of all of us, we see who you really are, and it is not power. Trump took a step back, his face pale. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He saw his world crumbling, his power losing its meaning. His gaze met the homeless man's again, and he knew he had lost. The homeless man looked at the crowd, his face, wet from the rain, now shining with confidence. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, he said, but today I know one thing. We are stronger when we are together, when we support each other, not trample each other. The crowd erupted in applause. People surrounded the homeless man, some offering him a hand, some offering him food, some simply smiling. It was a moment when indifference gave way to humanity, and although Trump was still standing, his figure now seemed small and insignificant in the context of what was happening around him. It was the day the homeless man didn't just rise from the steps. It was the day he became a symbol. The crowd around the homeless man grew denser. Faces that had previously turned away now looked at him with admiration. People began shouting words of encouragement, their voices mixing with the sound of the rain. The homeless man was no longer just a figure on the steps. He had become a symbol of the strength that can come from weakness. And Barro Trump, who had always considered himself unshakable, suddenly felt his confidence evaporating. He stood a little to the side, his hands shaking, though he tried to hide it by clenching them into fists. His gaze darted from one person to another, but he found no support anywhere. Just a few minutes ago, he had been the center of attention. His words seemed final, and now the crowd no longer looked at him with admiration. His face, always cold and confident, now began to reflect something else: fear. You're all crazy, he shouted, trying to be heard over the noise of the crowd. But his voice shook, and the trembling didn't escape the notice of those around him. You support him. Have you forgotten who I am? I'm the one who built my life. I'm the one who knows how this world works. The crowd didn't react. The murmurs grew louder, and they were filled with condemnation. Barro felt the ground slipping from under his feet. His usual weapons, words, confidence, strength no longer worked. He looked at the homeless man, who was now standing next to the man in the suit. This homeless man he had just humiliated seemed bigger than him. You think he's going to change anything? Trump shouted again, trying to maintain control. He's just a pathetic man who Saturday on the steps. What can he give you? The man in the suit turned to face him, his gaze calm, but there was something destructive in the calm confidence. You're afraid, Barro, he said, his voice low but heard by all. You're afraid because you see that your power was an illusion. You're afraid of being found out. Nonsense, Trump shouted, but his voice wavered again. He took a step back, his face turning pale. The crowd began to move closer, and he felt the space around him shrink. People that had been able to ignore before now became a threat to him. Their looks were full of condemnation, and each look was like a blow. I'm not afraid, he said, trying to regain his confidence. I'm strong. It's you. You who are weak. You want to take from me what I deserve. But his words rang hollow. Even he no longer believed what he was saying. He began to remember moments in his life when he had truly felt powerful, when he could make others feel worthless, and now that feeling was gone. You think strength is humiliation? The man in the suit spoke again. But that's not strength, Barro. That's fear. You humiliate because you're afraid that one day someone will stand up and look you in the eye. The words were like a knife. Trump took another step back, but there was only the crowd behind him, and it was not going to retreat. His breathing became rapid. His heart pounded in his chest. He felt that he was no longer in control of the situation, and this feeling was unbearable for him. You don't know anything about me, he said, his voice becoming quieter, almost a whisper. We know everything we need to know, the man in the suit replied. You're afraid because you understand that you no longer control this world. The crowd began shouting words. They weren't aimed at Trump personally, but each one was a blow to his confidence. He felt himself losing control, not only of the situation but of himself. His legs buckled, and he took another step back. I just wanted the world to be fair, he said, his voice shaky and weak. Fair for whom? Asked the man in the suit. Trump fell silent. At that moment, he realized that he had nothing to say. The crowd was looking at him, and there was no fear or respect in those looks. He felt small, insignificant, and in that moment, he realized his vulnerability. That was the moment his world began to crumble. Barro Trump stood in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by the looks he had previously despised and ignored. But now these looks were unbearable for him. Every look, every quiet phrase of the people around him was like a hammer blow to his confidence. He, accustomed to the world always listening to him, obeying him, suddenly found himself in a position where his words no longer meant anything. The crowd was no longer silent. People began to talk, quietly at first, but louder and louder. They told their stories, their grievances, their dreams. Their voices were full of pain, but also hope. Barro felt that these words were not for him, but they surrounded him, depriving him of air. His heart beat fast, as if he were trying to run away, but could not take a single step. "Look at him," someone from the crowd said. "He always talked about strength, but where is it now?" Barro tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. He took a step back, but the crowd only came closer. The people were no longer afraid of him. Their fear had been replaced by determination, and that was the most terrifying thing for him. The man in the suit stood next to the homeless man, who now stood up straight and looked at Trump with a steady gaze. It was the gaze of a man who would no longer be afraid, a man who had lost everything but found himself. "Barro Trump," the man in the suit said, his voice quiet but firm, "you've always said that the world belongs to the strong, but strength is not power or money. Strength is justice, and today, the world will remind you of what true strength is." These words were like a sentence. Barro took another step back, but behind him there was only a crowd. People no longer ignored him with their eyes, as before. Now their eyes met his, and he saw in them something he had not understood before. It was not malice. It was a sense of justice that could no longer be stopped. At that moment, a car pulled up. Police officers got out. They quickly approached Trump, and although their actions were polite, they left him no choice. One of them pulled out a warrant and, addressing Trump, said, "Mr. Trump, we have grounds to detain you on charges of human rights violations and incitement to hatred. You are welcome to come with us voluntarily." The crowd burst into applause. It wasn't a cry of anger. It was a sigh of relief, as if every person here finally felt that the world could be fair. Barro tried to object, his voice loud again, but now there was panic in it. "You can't. This is a mistake. I didn't do anything. It's them who are trying to destroy me." But his words no longer interested anyone. The police politely but firmly directed him to the car. The crowd parted, but not to let him pass. People watched him pass, and their faces expressed not anger, but satisfaction. The homeless man stood on the steps. His face was still wet from the rain, but he had a smile on his face. It wasn't a malicious smile, but the smile of a man who finally felt his voice was heard. He looked at the man in the suit, who nodded his support. "You saved me," the homeless man said quietly. "No," the man in the suit replied. "You saved yourself. I was just reminding you that you have power." The crowd began to disperse, but the air was different. People who had been silent before were now talking. This wasn't just the end for Barro Trump. It was the beginning of something new for everyone there. Barro, sitting in the car, felt for the first time that his world was truly collapsing. His power, his influence, everything was gone in an instant. Now he was alone, and this fear was new to him. It was not fear of the crowd, but of the truth, which had finally caught up with him. The street was silent again, but it was a different silence. It was a silence filled with hope that the world could be a better place. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have there been cases of injustice or racism in your life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. It is important for us to hear your voice. Each of your opinions helps us talk about important topics and create a space where no one remains unnoticed. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for being with us, and that together we can make the world a little better. If this story made you think or evoked emotions, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. It helps us to continue sharing such stories. We wish you a wonderful and kind day.